When I think back on it, my life didn't change in a burst of heavenly light or under the sweep of heroic music. There was no dramatic running to the airport gate, no big lottery ticket, no single rejection letter at the kitchen table that slammed a door shut. No, the day my future quietly made itself known to me happened on a perfectly ordinary morning, and its harbinger was a cup of coffee. The ritual was the same as 100 others before it. I sat near the warped window of my little apartment, sunlight shivering through cracked blinds, and wrapped my chilled hands around a mug that had known its share of knocks and chips. I was 24 or maybe 25 depending on which form I was filling out, and at that time I wore my uncertainty the way other people wore scarves, fashionable only if you didn't look too closely. I'd finished college with a major chosen by inertia and spent a few years drifting from job to job, city to city, each move a vague attempt to outrun the dull ache of not knowing how I fit into the world. That morning, the kettle whistled a little more desperately than usual, and my cheap supermarket coffee grounds bloomed with a scent that did little to mask their mediocrity. I poured the water, watched the dark swirl, and for a moment held the cup in both hands, just feeling the heat radiate into my palms. Maybe I stared into it a little too long, trying to see secrets in the curling steam, looking for meaning in the shifting patterns on the surface. They call it scrying, don't they? Peering into a cup to divine the future. I didn't know that then, or maybe I did, but on that particular morning it was less about magic, more about desperation. I wanted answers, any answers, about what my life was meant to be. Now, coffee is not just a beverage. It's an anchor, a pause button. In that moment, it was my admission ticket to a small sanctuary, a place where the future felt like it could be shaped, if only temporarily, by a deliberate act, the pouring of water, the waiting, the sipping. Sitting there, I realized something. All my life, I had been running from the sense that I needed to know what came next. Every time someone asked, "So, what do you do?" or "What's the plan?" my insides clenched, and I scrambled for something that sounded less empty than "I don't know." I envied people who declared their futures with confidence, doctors in white coats, engineers with blueprints, teachers with lesson plans and red pens. They seemed to exist on rails, predefined tracks from which only great tragedy could dislodge them. Me, though, I was perpetually off the tracks. I worked in bookstores and coffee shops, tried my hand at writing short stories that died slow, forgettable deaths in my hard drive. I often imagined my life as a hallway with doors on either side, none of them labeled, each leading somewhere utterly obscured. Every decision felt like a blind reach in the dark. That morning, as I stared into my coffee, I realized just how much time I'd spent waiting for the big moment, the blinding revelation, the aha epiphany that would write my story for me. It struck me that perhaps this, too, was a kind of wishful scrying. We're all searching for signs we can interpret, little prophecies that say, "Turn left," or "This is the right person," or "Take that job." A palm reader traces the lines of a hand, an astrologer charts the stars, but most of us improvise, borrowing rituals from the everyday. I had made a habit of looking for the grand in the mundane, hoping some pattern would reveal itself. But on that particular morning, I looked up, and the kitchen was filled not with answers, but with small, quiet things, the hum of the refrigerator, a shaft of sunlight catching on floating dust, the steady warmth of the cup. My own breath, slow and visible in the cold air. I realized that if there was magic, it was not in the coffee, but in the act of noticing. It sounds so simple, bordering on cliché, but that recognition changed something in me. I stopped waiting for my life to start and began asking a different question. What would happen if I treated every small moment as if it mattered? What if I stopped demanding destiny and started paying attention? There's a paradox in the way we think about the future. We see it as this vast, unmapped territory, and we stand at its edge like explorers with a broken compass. But the truth is, the future is more like a fog that lifts one step at a time. Most of the time, you see only as far as the next step. The rest is guesswork, luck, improvisation. That lesson came to me in a flood of memories I'd never bothered to assemble before. The way my mother used to sit beside me in the mornings, her own mug cradled between her hands as she watched the news in silence. How my childhood best friend, Julia, once said that our dreams for the future were less like blueprints and more like collages pasted together from magazine clippings and Sunday afternoon fantasies, or how, at 16, I'd spent an entire summer building a treehouse that never supported more than a house cat's weight, but in the end, it didn't matter because the building had mattered, not the finished product. I finished my coffee. I washed the cup carefully, dried it with a clean towel. Then I pulled out a notebook and a pen, a physical one, not my battered laptop with its blinking cursor and hostile blankness, and wrote 3 things I'd noticed that morning: the way the light shifted when the kettle boiled, the echo of a bird's call from the alleyway, the sensation of warmth in my hands. My plans that day didn't change visibly. I still worked my shift at the bakery down the street, exchanged banter with the regulars, restocked the croissants. I pretended, as I always did, that the world was uncomplicated, and I went home tired. But something small had shifted inside me. Over the weeks and months that followed, I kept the ritual. Coffee first, notebook second. Sometimes the words flowed, sometimes they didn't. Sometimes I wrote down ambitious dreams, write a novel, travel to Japan, fall in reckless, inconvenient love, and sometimes I just wrote what I saw: kids in bright jackets skipping over puddles, the old woman who fed pigeons at the park bench, the taste of buttered toast eaten in bed. At first, the notebook was just a record of survival, proof that I was still here, noticing things, even if the big picture remained forever out of focus. But slowly, those little entries began to coalesce. Patterns emerged. I discovered that my happiest moments were not when I chased after some glittering future, but when I was wholly present in a single, small experience: the act of making something, the pause between tasks, the warmth of holding something just because it was comforting. One afternoon, maybe 6 months after that first coffee morning, I was sitting in a park, scribbling in my notebook, when a woman interrupted me. She worked for a local publisher and noticed that I was always writing, always present, always attentive. She asked if I'd ever thought about putting together a collection, a series of essays about ordinary mornings, small joys, overlooked rituals. I laughed at first. What possible worth could there be in my scribbled observations, my obsession with breakfast and city buses and the way puddles reflected sunlight? But she was persistent. And in her interest, I saw something I hadn't seen before: the possibility that the future didn't have to be a capital F future. It didn't need to be monumental, mapped out, or altogether different from the present moment. Perhaps the future was simply a series of nows, strung together with attentive care, each one a bead added to a thread. I took her up on the offer because it felt like a door opening, not with a crash, but with a soft click. The process of collecting my notes, sifting through tiny episodes of daily life, transformed me. I noticed how much of our lives passes unnoticed, how easy it is to slip into routine so deeply that we forget we are living it for the first and only time. Somewhere along the way, I realized that my fear wasn't about the future as an abstract expanse. It was about the possibility that I would live my life asleep, the days blurring into one another until I arrived at the end, not knowing how I got there. The future, I learned, isn't something you find in a magical object or a single moment of revelation. It's what you build, one observation, one habit, one imperfect decision at a time. Even now, years later, every future I have found has begun in a very small present. I still drink my coffee in the mornings, still use mismatched mugs, still write in a notebook. I've met people who embrace uncertainty, who think of the future as a series of experiments: scientists, artists, parents, dreamers. Their wisdom, if you want to call it that, is not in foreseeing a destiny, but in accepting that the future is built out of whatever you are willing to notice and nurture today. I've lost things, too. I lost my grandmother that winter, the one who taught me how to sit still and listen for the secret language of the house settling in the wind. I lost my friend Julia, not to death, but to the tides of life that pull people to opposite coasts. Some futures arrive simply as the slow uncoupling of familiar things. I've learned to mourn them, to let that grief become part of the texture of my own mornings. And yet, the coffee ritual remains. When I started, it was an act of avoidance, a way to delay the day, to conjure answers from steam and warmth. Now it is a practice of showing up. Not for destiny, not for grand revelation, but for the act of being alive inside my own skin. Sometimes friends ask me how I became a writer, or how I knew what I wanted. I tell them the truth that I didn't know, that most days I still don't. I tell them about the cup of coffee, the morning light, the endless pages of ordinary things. I say that the future is a cup waiting to be filled, and the only way to find what you want in it is to pay attention to the act of pouring. I think of people everywhere clutching their own mugs at kitchen tables, in silent offices, half hidden on city sidewalks. So many of us are searching, not for a sign, but for a sense that our small, daily choices matter, that the future is not a fixed endpoint but a story told in the details of how we spend our time, whom we love, what we notice. Some mornings, I still look for answers in the swirl of steam, the gentle ripples on the surface. I see my own face reflected there, older, perhaps a little steadier, and I remember that every future begins exactly like this, in a moment of quiet attention, a willingness to be here, in the present, while the world outside rushes toward whatever comes next. So if you were to ask me what happened in that moment, on that ordinary morning with an ordinary cup of coffee, I would say this: I found my future not by seeking it, but by learning to notice the present. Noticing became the thread that stitched my days together. The future, I discovered, is an accumulation of mornings like that, of moments when we stop reaching for certainty and instead allow ourselves to see, to feel, to be unsettled and inspired by the smallness and beauty of our now. I think this is what it means to find your future in a cup of coffee. Not that the cup itself contains the answer, but that it invites you to slow down, to attend, to let go of the mad chase for prophetic certainty. You bring your hands to the warmth, you lift the cup, you taste the bitter and the sweet, and in so doing, you meet whatever comes after, not with anxiety, but with presence. Mornings pass into afternoons, cups fill and empty, notebooks gather dust, and then new words. The future, I realize, is not a destination at all. It's the ongoing act of being awake to these moments, one sip at a time.